Welcome. I appreciate those of you who are able to join us this evening. My name is Christine Fife, and I'm with Big Sky Public Relations, and I'm working on behalf of the Montana Department of Transportation. I'm the communications manager for the Batavia Intersection Improvements Project, and I'm available to help throughout the course of this outreach. I'll share my contact information at the end of the presentation for anyone wanting additional communication. My role is to help MDT in a number of ways, including being a point of contact for folks like you with questions, comments, or concerns as they pertain to the Batavia Intersection Improvements Project. Due to COVID-19, many of you were unable to attend the one-on-one appointments that we hosted last month in Kalispell. The purpose of this meeting is to provide an additional opportunity for the project team to offer information and answer questions while maintaining the health and safety of attendees. Joining me today are Bob Bozen, John Schmidt, and Kelly Williams of MDT. Would you all take a moment to just say hi and introduce yourselves?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Bob Bozen. I'm the district administrator for the Missoula District with Montana Department of Transportation. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight and just echo that I'm sorry we can't meet in person, but I do thank you for taking time out of your busy day to attend, and encourage you to ask questions and make sure that we answer any questions you may have as we go through the presentation tonight. Thank you.
And good evening, everybody. I'm John Schmidt. I'm the Missoula District Construction Engineer, generally responsible for construction in the western part of the state, and a permanent longtime resident of the Flathead Valley.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Kelly Williams. I'm the Consultant Design Project Manager for MDT on this project. Thank you all for taking the time to join us this evening.
Thanks, guys. We're also joined this evening by representatives from our engineering team, Robert Pesha and Associates. The engineers have been hard at work developing improvement options for this intersection and are here to explain the alternatives for us. RPA folks, would you introduce yourselves?
Yeah, thanks, Christine, and hi, everyone. My name is Scott Randall, and I'm with RPA, and I'm the project manager for this phase of the project. And my role here is to help with this alternatives evaluation process and to help us identify the best solution for this intersection.
Hello, everyone. I'm April Girth, also at RPA, and I'm the design engineer and will be responsible for development of the project plans.
Thank you. Also with us is my colleague, Katie Cleets. She'll be monitoring the Q&A system to address your questions as cohesively as possible at the end of the presentation. Katie, can you say hello and explain the question and answer process to our attendees?
Thanks, Christine. Hello, everyone. As Christine said, my name is Katie Cleets, and I'm also with Big Sky Public Relations. I'll be watching the Q&A system throughout the presentation. That's the button that Bob was mentioning earlier. It's at the bottom of your screen that looks like two chat bubbles. So at the end of the presentation, we will hold a question and answer session. If you have a question at any point in time, please feel free to type it into the Q&A chat box, and we can address all of the questions at the end. But again, please feel free to enter them at any time. As we all know, technology can be unpredictable at times, so we appreciate your patience. We'll be recording this presentation and placing it on the project webpage for viewing later. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bob to get us a bit of background on the project.
There was that technology challenge right there. I started talking before I unmuted myself. So again, just a brief overview on the project. This project is focused on the intersection of Batavia Lane and US 2. The project came about back in 2014. FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration, took on a safety audit of a stretch of Highway 2 that included this area, and they identified this intersection as one that was has a high risk for severe crashes. This intersection has some unique challenges. The proximity of Kelly Ray's gas station and the approaches that to get in and out of Kelly Ray's, and how they're literally right at the intersection. The fact that there's a very well attended elementary school also right at the intersection with a parking area that's also extremely close to the intersection itself. We've got the Batavia waterfowl production area, as you can see to the right-hand side there. That's protected land, so really limits what we can do as far as making any shifts with the roadway or any expansion of the roadway in that direction. And coupled with the fact that this is US Highway 2, there is a reduced speed zone in the area, but there's some confusion with that, and there's a frequency of drivers that are not following the reduced speed. All of these things combine to make for a really unique situation and a very challenging situation. So it's one that MDT and our partners at RPA are working hard to figure out the best way to address this. Several years ago when the project was first identified, the initial thought or plan was just to develop a solution, find the money, and begin construction as soon as the funds were available. MDT decided, however, to step back, take a look at it, and make sure that we came up with the best solution possible to meet the needs of the traveling public and the users of the facilities in the area, Kelly Ray's, the school, and the production area, as well as the landowners in the area. So we developed a plan to sit down and talk to various members of the community, which we've done in several steps, and this is yet another component of that. Our previous outreach took many forms, and we learned a great deal. That has helped us to get to where we are now. So I'm going to turn this over to Scott with RPA, and he's going to talk through some of the initial outreach that we've performed and what we learned from that. Scott?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So way back in March, what seems like a long time ago, just prior to the onset of COVID, back when we could actually still meet in person, we held a public open house at the Smith Valley School. I'm sure some of you were able to attend that. The purpose of the meeting at that time was to basically identify what the concerns are and the issues are at the intersection prior to developing solutions. As Bob mentioned, we wanted to make sure that we understood really what we're trying to solve out here and what the concerns are instead of just backing our way into a solution. So for those of you that were able to attend that meeting, and maybe for those of you that were not able to attend at that time, one of the things that we did during that meeting was we had an exercise where we were focused on identifying the top priorities for improvements to the intersection. For this exercise, we actually gave each person at the meeting 3 beads and asked them to place them in jars which represent their top priorities. So they could place all their beads in one jar if they wanted to, or they could distribute them amongst multiple jars. And so the graphic you see here on the screen represents the results of that exercise and really helps to show and helps us identify kind of what the top priorities were as indicated at that meeting by those who attended. So as you can see in the graphic, providing a safe crossing for pedestrians was by far the highest priority. It received more than twice as many beads as any of the other priorities. So, that makes us, want to ensure that anything that we're doing, we're providing that safe crossing for pedestrians who are crossing the highway at this location. So you can also see that a couple other priorities that received a fair amount of votes would be improving the left turn from Batavia Lane and then decreasing speeds, which is something Bob mentioned as well. So we also, there's some other priorities that were identified, such as access and circulation, some visibility concerns, traffic flow, large trucks, some other things that we're also considering, but they definitely weren't as high of a priority in the eyes of the public, but still things that we're thinking about moving forward. So following that meeting, we went back and worked to identify, all possible solutions that we could think of to the intersection. So we looked at everything from simple changes to the approaches to maybe a realignment to the skewed intersection. Looked at signals, roundabouts, the potential for relocating the intersection, maybe to the southwest. We looked at a grade separated pedestrian crossing at the location. Basically, threw everything out there that we could possibly think of. This resulted in 12 possible alternatives that we looked at. We then evaluated each of those 12 alternatives to kind of look at how each one of them would address, those top concerns we heard from the public and, the other things that we're trying to do with this project as well. So any alternative of those 12 that did not at least partially address those top concerns, we dropped from further consideration. So this process and evaluating these alternatives actually resulted in four that we decided would warrant further consideration. Those four alternatives included an option to realign the intersection and installed raised medians while keeping the stop sign along Batavia Lane. It also identified two options, which included traffic signals, one of which would include raised medians and one of which did not have raised medians. And then the fourth option was a single lane roundabout option. So the next step after identifying those four alternatives was to present them to the key stakeholders and the public. We had one-on-one public meetings last month, which I think went pretty well. We had a lot of people attending, and so we discussed these alternatives and with those people that attended there, and again, those key stakeholders. So after many of these discussions with, the area residents, county commissioners, school representatives, Kelly Rays, the fire department, and others, it became pretty clear that, while we kind of looked at these four options, there's really two that stood out best as meeting the needs of the intersection. So these two options, which is really where we're at today and what we're focused on moving forward, include a single lane roundabout alternative and a traffic signal with raised medians. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to April, who's going to walk us through these two alternatives in more detail.
Thanks, Scott. So the first of the two options that best meet these priorities was determined as a single lane roundabout. And some benefits of the roundabout are speed reduction due to the raised medians and the curve's approaches to the intersection, the ability for vehicles to make U-turns, a reduction in crashes, most particularly in severe crashes, and safer crossings for pedestrians. So I'd like to expand a little bit more on these topics, and we'll start with safety. So roundabouts are unique intersections in that for both motorists and pedestrians, there's only a need to look for traffic in one direction at a time. So for example, let's look at the left turn from Batavia onto US 2. So in a typical intersection, you would need to look for and wait for vehicles coming from your left headed into Kalispell, people's coming from your right headed out west away from town, as well as be aware of cars that are in the west US turn lane trying to turn onto Batavia. So with all of that happening, there are a lot of potential places for crashes to occur. In a roundabout, the only vehicles you need to look for are those in the roundabout already and to your left. Additionally, should you make a mistake and pull out in front of a car, the resulting crash would just be a side swipe or a rear end, instead of a typically more dangerous higher speed T-bone crash. So these same benefits apply to pedestrians as well. So as pedestrians only need to look to the left to begin crossing the roadway. After they cross the first lane, if the second lane is not clear, they can stop and wait in the center island for a gap to cross. The distance to cross is much shorter as well, just the two narrow roadways versus 3 lanes with wider shoulders at a typical intersection. And the speeds of vehicles when they approach the crosswalk will be much lower for the roundabout as well, since if a traffic signal were to be green or there were no stop signs or traffic signals at all, then vehicles would be traveling at highway speeds, which would likely result in death if they were to strike a pedestrian at that high speed. But speeds within the roundabout will be closer to 25 miles per hour at the crosswalk. And although the idea of a pedestrian being struck at any speed is terrible, the lower speed much increases the chance of survival and less severe injuries. Additionally, RRFBs, or rapid rectangular flashing beacons, as installed in Big Fork, would also be installed at the crosswalks to allow pedestrians to push a button, which would turn on some bright flashing LED lights to alert drivers that the pedestrians are crossing the road. And roundabouts can be designed to accommodate large trucks as well, which is important in this location. So the center island has a truck apron, which is shown in the light gray in the center of the graphic of the roundabout. And the intent of this apron is to allow the rear tires of the trailer of a semi to track into the center area of the roundabout as the driver steers around the outside travel lane. And the apron is low and almost flat, so as trucks will easily mount the curb and their loads will have minimal shift and it won't be really discomfortable to the driver or uncomfortable. Even oversized loads will be able to pass through the roundabout. So as design of a roundabout progresses, we look at extra truck aprons, sometimes on the outside of the curb, to fit even the largest trucks on the road, such as windmill blade transports. But every option has negatives and positives. The downside of a roundabout is that they are relatively new in Montana and require motorists to change from what they're comfortable with. So educating drivers and pedestrians must also occur when the roundabout is installed. So the second option that best meets the determined priorities is a traffic signal. And the signal has many benefits as well. The new raised medians would reduce traveling speeds and limit where cars can enter and leave US 2, reducing potential conflict points between people trying to turn off and on the roadway and between the through traveling vehicles. Additionally, the intersection would be realigned to slow vehicles turning right onto Batavia and to improve visibility. A new right turn lane onto Batavia would remove slowing vehicles from the stream of faster through traffic. It is sometimes difficult to make left turn from Batavia onto US 2 would be much easier, and traffic on Batavia would only back up when the signal is red. However, most of the time the signal for Batavia would be red to allow for the higher volume US 2 to mostly not have to stop. So when a car approaches the intersection on Batavia, the signal would begin the process of turning green for Batavia and stopping traffic on US 2. And crosswalks will be better protected as well. They'll be protected with the standard and easily understood walk, don't walk, and countdown timer indications. So signals are also very familiar to us and would require no additional education. But again, every option has its good and bad, and the negatives of the signal are that if a vehicle would run the red light, the results can be a devastating high-speed T-bone crash or a high-speed impact with a pedestrian, as we talked about before. So speeds in front of the school would not physically be reduced. So therefore, if someone were to break the speed limit, they could still proceed through the area at high speed. Also, during low volume times outside of the busy morning and evening rush, cars trying to turn left from Batavia will almost always have to stop at a red light and wait for the signal to cycle through for US 2 before a green appears. And so a couple items to note on both of these options. As the community, as Bob mentioned before, the community has spoken loud and clear that there should be a change in the speed limit signs. The 45-mile-an-hour signs will be moved further from the intersection to allow more time for drivers to slow down before reaching the intersection. And they'll be easier to see once we move them away from all the other signs and all the clutter in the intersection area. Also, MDT is working with Kelly Reyes to make access modifications for both alternatives to better direct vehicles entering and leaving the business to improve safety and circulation within their site, as well as coordinating with the school and other landowners. So the graphics shown today are still very preliminary and will be changing as we work through the needs of the adjacent business and landowners. And you may also note that the second approach to the school, the one closest to the intersection, will be closed in both options. So that parking lot is used only for teachers, and eliminating one driveway would help direct traffic where to go and to reduce some additional conflict points. So as mentioned above, both options improve the intersection. So to determine how well each meets the needs and priorities identified by the community that Scott talked about, we evaluated all the options. The amount of green in each circle indicates how well that alternative met that particular need. So based on the green circles, these two options are well matched in some areas, while each option comes out ahead in some other areas. For example, safe crossings, left turns, visibility, and right turns they're about equal for both options, but the roundabout is more effective than the signal for reducing speeds and for the actual movement of traffic to reduce delay for drivers. However, although the roundabout can accommodate large trucks, the traffic signal does do a better job. So John, would you like to talk to us about how a decision will be made and the next steps in the process?
You bet. So all of the input we've received and will hopefully continue to receive in the coming weeks will be considered by the team before a decision is made and a final design is drafted. This graphic shows how many factors must be taken into consideration before a decision is made. Public input is only one of these factors. When determining the appropriate option for this intersection, the project team will also need to consider maintenance needs, accessibility, safety, cost, and several other things. And really that leads us to our next steps. This graphic illustrates the three major phases of a construction of a project. This project has undergone the planning phase and has entered the project development. During project development, an option for the intersection will be chosen, a design will be produced, funding secured, and any of the necessary right-of-way will be acquired. All of this needs to be completed before the project will move to construction. As I'm sure you can tell, this is not a quick and easy process. There is not a definitive timeline identified for this project, but it is reasonable to believe that construction could begin in the next 3 to 6 years.
Thank you, everyone. That concludes the formal presentation portion of this meeting, but we're going to move into questions and answers. The team will work to address as many questions as we can, and if we're unable to get to your question today, we'll take your contact information and be in touch following the meeting. I'll go ahead and leave this slide up with my contact information, so anyone who's interested in additional information can feel free to contact me. So with that, Katie, do we have any questions that would need to be addressed?
Thanks, Christine. It doesn't look like we have any comments, excuse me. But for our 3 attendees, if you do have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and type those into the Q&A system and we're happy to address them.
Thanks, Katie. While we're waiting for any of our attendees to type in any questions, maybe our project team could talk about some frequently asked questions that we get on this project. One that we hear often is, why don't you just lower the speed limit? Could someone talk about that briefly?
How about we all jump in there at once?
Well, I was trying to talk, Bob, but I had my mute button on, so.
All right, I'll let you go first then.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, this is Scott. Yeah, I can jump in on that one. So, lowering the speed limit is something we hear quite a bit about. Bob mentioned it when we first started, that one of the biggest complaints, at this location is the speeds, through the area. Right now it is signed as 45 miles per hour through this school zone, but it's a very short school zone. And, even 45 when you're a pedestrian sitting there can feel very fast. One other thing we hear quite a bit about is, yeah, it's signed 45, but nobody drives 45 through there. So, a couple things I'd point to at that, if we go out there and change speed limit signs, it's not going to be a guarantee that people are going to follow those signs, just as they don't do that today. So while we could sign it for 35 or 25, if we felt like it, if we decided we wanted to do that, that again, that's no guarantee that could, that's actually going to result in people slowing down through there. So that's one of the concerns and why we don't go set speed limits, just how we feel. And there's actually a pretty defined process to set speed limits, and it's pretty complex. And I'm not going to get into all the details today, but there's actually a transportation commission that is the legal authority to make speed limit changes and to sign those. It's actually not MDT's jurisdiction to go out and sign them as they see fit. So I guess the biggest thing is that if we want people to slow down, we need to make sure to force them to slow down by changing the environment or changing conditions, so that it makes people want to slow down versus just telling them to do it and hoping that they'll slow down.
Thank you. Another question that we get asked frequently is, why don't you consider building an overpass or an underpass for pedestrians at this intersection?
Sounds like a good one for April. Do you want to jump in on that one?
Absolutely. So this is a great question, and we did hear it from quite a few people, because obviously taking pedestrians and those kids off the highway is absolutely the safest choice for them. However, so we did look at it, and we looked at both an underpass and an overpass. And we'll start with the underpass. One of the problems that we have in this location is a really, really high water table. And we need to go down below the roadway a pretty substantial distance, upwards of 10 to 14 feet, to get the passageway that we need and enough dirt basically over the new structure to keep it sound. When we get down this far, we start wondering if we're going to fill this pipe up with water. So that is one of the issues. The second issue is to get down 10 or 14 feet takes a very, very long distance, because according to the American Disabilities Act, we need to have a maximum slope of 5% on any of our sidewalks. And so you can just kind of do the math to get down 10, 14 feet at 5% takes a very, very, very long distance. It's not so much of a problem on the west side, but on the east side where we're constrained by the school, we actually looked at it and that sidewalk would not come out until you were all the way almost back to the back parking lot. And along with that, not only just the issues of constructability of it, it's also going to be basically a hole that the kids would be in, which is generally kind of unsafe and probably an uncomfortable experience for children to go into anyway. So our second option was an overpass. And the overpass, as we've found, we've constructed these in several places in Montana. And first of all, you still do have the ADA issues. You still need to get up there on a 5% ramp. But an even worse problem is we have found that people don't want to climb. And so if we put in an overpass and they have an easy option of just crossing the street instead, a vast majority of people just cross the street. And we've seen this in some of our overpasses where you can see this really beautiful structure and then we see this little dirt path where everyone is bypassing the structure and just walking across the road. So that is almost doubly dangerous because now the drivers are expecting these kids and pedestrians to be crossing in the overpass and they're not, they're crossing on the roadway surface with no extra protection. So although they're wonderful ideas and they appear to be probably the safest options we have, the site constraints and the way that people use them make them just not very viable at this location.
Thanks, April. This is Katie. So Mr. Nelson, it looks like you have your hand up, but unfortunately we don't have an opportunity to somewhat unmute you. Would it be possible for you to ask your question or put your comment in that Q&A chat box so we can see it and then go ahead and respond from there?
Thanks, Katie. While we're waiting for that, one other question that we get quite frequently is, how do you know that these large trucks are going to be able to navigate through a roundabout? And I know that that's a big concern for a lot of the big trucking companies that run trucks through this area, particularly logging and farming equipment. Bob, could you speak to that a little bit about maybe some outreach that you've done and some work that you've done with the trucking companies and the Trucking Association and roundabout development?
You bet. Yeah, that's something that we didn't enter into lightly. I like to say that the roundabouts that everybody is used to traveling here in the Flathead up on the Kalispell Bypass. And for those of you that don't know me, I also am a resident of Flathead Valley. My kids go to Flathead High School, so I travel the Kalispell Bypass frequently. But like I said, I like to say, don't hold those roundabouts against us. That was version 1.0, and MDT has worked diligently along with our design firms, and we've learned a lot from what was done previously. And so the new roundabouts that we're constructing today are different than what was kind of our first versions of them. And one of the outreach mechanisms that we utilized, I believe it was about 16 months ago, back in April or May of last year, maybe. I don't remember for sure when it was, but we put together we laid out to a full-scale roundabout at the fairgrounds in Kalispell, and we invited members of the trucking industry to bring their vehicles over and drive through this roundabout and see what the layout looked like. Help us identify things that maybe we were missing, changes we could make to make this the new roundabout as good as possible. How can we improve it for the trucking industry? How can we improve it for the construction industry? How can we improve it for the logging industry? And we had great turnout. We had we had a logger from Eureka there. We had farmers from the lower valley there. We had implement dealers there. We had Knife River brought one of their belly dumps pulling a full-length pup behind it, so that vehicle was over 100 feet long. And they were all able to practice, if you will, with the roundabout and help us identify some changes. We did make some tweaks and some little changes to the design, and we're taking the knowledge and that we learned in that process, carrying it forward, and we made changes to the upcoming Dern and Spring Creek project, and we've used that on other designs around the state. So you know, that was one of the things where we're truly diving into the community outreach and trying to get as much input and take what we're hearing back to the design and making things work as well as possible.
That's great information, Bob. Thank you for sharing that. I think at this point, we'll wrap up this webinar. If any of our participants have additional questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is on the screen. You can call our project hotline at 406-207-4484 and speak to someone. And the project team is always happy to hear from residents and about your concerns and questions. So please don't hesitate to reach out if something comes to mind following this presentation. We really appreciate your taking time to be with us this evening and for your concern for this particular area. And we hope you all have a great night.